It's been a deadly year in America, including here in Massachusetts. 16 people have been murdered in Boston so far this year, and the city's largest neighborhood is also its most affected, Dorchester. 5 people have been shot and killed there, up from just 2 at the same time last year. The mayor's office has already pledged to intervene, promising to cut homicides in the city by 20% in the next few years, which would bring the city to a 25-year low. A final plan is expected to come later this month, highlighting a key issue: young people affected by gang violence. It's also a top priority for local anti-violence activists, a group of whom will meet later this week in Dorchester to campaign for better outreach, job programs, and criminal justice reform. Organizers will also screen parts of the 2020 documentary This Ain't Normal, which spotlights 5 young gang members in Boston and the efforts of mentors and social workers to break the cycle of violence.
We lost our first friend at 15. He died at 15. 2004, lost another one. 2005, lost another one. 2006, lost 2 more.
These young men really need to see, that positive image of who they really could be.
We have to teach the young brothers and sisters in our community what it means to live.
I'm joined now by one of the people featured in that documentary, Donald Osgood Sr., Interim Director of the Neighborhood Trauma Team Network, and Ruth Zakarin, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence and the host of Thursday's event. Donald Osgood Sr. and Ruth Zakarin, thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for being here. I want to talk about this film. I feel like we are at this moment right now in Boston where, if we look at just the numbers, we talk about homicides, things have been pretty consistently low in terms of the numbers, but if you talk to anybody who's living in the most affected neighborhoods in Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, it doesn't feel low. And we've had a few really high-profile cases involving kids as young as 14 in the last couple of years. How did this movie kind of come about, and what are your thoughts on it now, just a couple of years out, as we're seeing in recent years this spike in youth-involved crime?
So the film initially was to raise money to keep Street Safe Boston, in operation, and they were supposed to follow the street workers. And once they started coming out with a few of us who agreed to do it, the young people wanted to tell their stories. So Coach Dennis and Rudy Hippolyte, they decided, let's tell the story of the young people and give them a life, make the human side sing. So they started working on that, and the young people had a lot to say. And, you look at it from 2 years, and we're talking the films, we started doing the film in 2013, so it didn't really get released until 2020. But from 2020 to now, we're missing Street Safe Boston. Street Safe Boston shut down 2014, the beginning of 2015. And since then, it's been different. We were able to do a lot of unconventional things. There were no unions to hold us back, so we were sometimes up late night talking to different people when shootings happened, just to make sure that nothing else happened, no retaliation. So, yeah.
How long have you been doing this work?
So unofficially, I was doing this work just in my neighborhood, throughout the city. I grew up here. And in 2013, I had an opportunity to work with Street Safe Boston, which elevated the work that I was doing. And not only was I working with the youth, I was also doing response work with Street Safe Boston, and we partnered with VIA, Violence Intervention Advocacy Program at Boston Medical Center, where we responded to just about every shooting and stabbing. And I did that for 6 years before I transitioned to the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, which helps families in that first 24 to 72 hours of a homicide.
Yeah. This is a question, I guess, for both of you, but I'm curious about your perspective, Ruth, of this moment in time, right? When we talked about the numbers, murders are down, or some of these high-profile cases involving young people. Those are really alarming. When we look at how things have changed, do you feel like right now there is this crisis? We've talked a little bit about how the city's responding. District Attorney Kevin Hayden has also launched a couple of efforts to try to respond in some way, and there's supposedly some kind of movement that's happening. I know there's a lot of activists that are working towards creating a more unified movement. I'm curious just what you think we're seeing now that maybe we haven't seen in previous years, or what is required now if we're reaching this point where we're kind of reaching a crisis.
Yeah, I always think about the fact that the statistics don't tell the full story of the trauma that people are experiencing, particularly in the neighborhoods that are most affected. So the numbers can only tell us a little bit, and I think that's the power of this film, is telling those stories, both of the young people who have been impacted by violence and the people who are showing up day in and day out for those young people. And ultimately, if we have one death from gun violence, one family bereaved, one community traumatized, we have a crisis. We shouldn't have any deaths from gun violence. There are ways to prevent this and make this narrative different. And so I think we're at a moment of really recognizing that there is more that needs to be done, that this should be a solvable problem, and we have to have the will to solve it.
You had organizers recently. I covered a die-in, which is organized by Teen Empowerment. You had some representatives there. Kids went out, really young kids, all from Dorchester, Roxbury, surrounding neighborhoods, and they were really invested in demonstrating and showing that they truly care about this issue and that it's meaningful to them. And I found it really powerful because I think sometimes there's a couple of different narratives. One is that, communities have to deal with this for themselves, which is very flawed because that wouldn't even really be possible. But there's a lot of stuff generating from communities, but also that people don't care in these communities. And these kids were showing that people absolutely do care and are just fed up. And at the same time, these are young people, and I really appreciate the name of the movie, because these are young people who over and over have told me it becomes normalized, right? It's something that we experience and we see, and we can't have time to process the trauma of one killing by the time that we hear about the next one, or maybe that was your friend or your loved one or your family member. So I'm curious just what your kind of takeaway was from that event and from the similar push that you've seen.
Yeah, Teen Empowerment has been really incredible around empowering young people in this conversation. And the idea, the way that I understood it, is that they stop traffic because business should not go on as normal when people are dying and people are experiencing trauma. And I think the way that they engage the entire community is really symbolic of what coalition building is. Young people have a strong voice, but we adults have to keep on showing up for young people and with young people and adding our voices to calling for solutions and actually making change happen.
There have been calls I know the movie was made in 2020, and there were calls around that time and during the protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd to remove school resource officers from schools in Boston. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that and the evolution of that and the role of police, because I've looked at how violence affected communities since Boston had this huge spike of youth violence in the 70s and 80s and 90s. We saw the Boston Miracle, which is where these homicides were brought down by, I think, like 65% per month. And a lot of that was credited to relationships that activists had with police at the time, and with this overall effort throughout the city, this kind of organized effort throughout the city. But I wonder now, do you think that with the relationships that exist between the police and activists and advocates and the clergy and everybody else, do you think that it's possible to get back to that, or is that something that needs to be worked towards?
So I think it's possible, but I think it's going to take a lot more work than what we are able to do at this moment. We have a lot of things going on, and I think during the George Floyd era, and the defunding police, I think the message was wrong. Maybe it should have been a cry for restructuring, more training and things like that, because there's still a lot of great relationships. I can't do the work I do without law enforcement, and it's not a two-way thing, like the law enforcement sometimes will give us some things that we need to support families, but we don't give information. Otherwise then we could be, putting ourselves in harm's way as well. So I think the relationships are very important. The trust building is very important. And when you think about the Boston public school system, pulling out the resource officers at the time I think was a bad idea. But I know that right now they're working on adding more youth workers to the school system, which I think will be great. My only concern is always the summertime, because there's not enough for young people to do. We do have a lot of jobs that are available, private and city jobs right now for our young people, but some young people don't want to do that. So I think really wrapping around and working together, and I think this is the last thing I say to that. If we as coalition building, right, we start to work together, I think, and we lead the young people by example, I think that would actually be a great asset, because young people, they follow what they see. And so if we want to see them do the right thing, then us as adults have to do the right thing as well.
Mental health has been a huge issue for young people in the last couple of years, especially for young people living in these communities that are most impacted by violence. The Boston Globe they did an analysis of police interactions since 2016, and I think 51 out of 88 of them were people experiencing a mental health crisis. So I wonder how that kind of falls. I know we're talking about adults in that context as well, but when you've got young people in schools who are acting out after COVID, that was very traumatizing, this compounding violence and trauma. How do things fall into that conversation? You mentioned bringing in youth workers, which I think is probably key.
Right. So with mental health, one of the things with the mental health piece, I have 2 young sons, so they were also involved in the 2020, like COVID work, going to school from home. I think that had a huge impact on a lot of the kids, because there wasn't that, I don't get to see my friend in person. Now we're seeing each other on Zoom. Or now we can't go outside, all those different things. So, young people have to move around. And so I think 2020 just kind of pushed all the young people down. So the ones that made it through to graduate, kudos to them. But with the mental health piece and police, I think it's just more training. We have to utilize new techniques, right? Our old techniques don't work, because this is just a new time, new generation of people. Young people have a stronger voice than they did, And our day it was, do what I say, but don't do as I do. Right now, young people, they have a voice, and if I don't like what you're doing, I'm not going to do it. And if you want me to do something, you have to tell me why. So really working on being culturally competent when we deal with the young people, having more therapists and teachers that look like the youth that they serve. Right? I think that's one of the biggest things that will be a huge help in, bridging gaps with mental health, bridging gaps with law enforcement, bridging gaps with, community violence. And the last thing I'll add in there, we don't talk enough about is, mediation, teaching people mediation techniques, teaching young people how to express themselves, that there is a way to do it without resorting to violence.
Yeah, and if I could just add that one of the really powerful things about the film is, as it tells the story of these young people, it really highlights how much trauma they have all been through. And you have a different understanding of young people who've been involved with violence and all of the things that came before the violent incident happened. And for me, I'm also a licensed mental health clinician by background. I did trauma response for many years. And for me, when I think about prevention, violence prevention, any kind of prevention, for me, it's really about making sure that young people, all people, have what they need to be safe and well. We can't expect them to be safe and well if they don't have those resources. So I think a lot about how are we responding to this trauma that collectively young people have experienced, and individually what has happened in their own homes and in their communities, and how are we adults showing up to support them with that.
Yeah. What do you think people, quickly, we have just about a minute, but what do you think people don't understand about this issue? What do people need to understand? Because you work with young people, right? And I think...
Yes. I think one of the misconceptions is that most of these young people, animals, and that this is what they want to do, right? And I don't think I've met a person on the planet who's woke up and said to themselves, you know, I think I'm going to die today, or I think I want to get shot today or stabbed today, right? So I think that is the first beginning to really humanize people, like we're all humans. And, you know, to Ruth's point, if we don't have the resources in the communities for the young people, right, you know, the system is kind of stacked against them. And until we understand that, you know, we'll go around in circles, we'll come up with this plan, we'll come up with that plan, but really, you know, changing a lot of the laws, you know, which have a negative impact in certain communities, right, because it's designed to do what it does. But, you know, knowing that these young people, they love their moms, they love their dads, they love their children, they love their nannies. And when you see them like kids, right, most times you'll see a young person portrayed, they're 14, right, young black man 14, young black child 14, but he's a black man when he's portrayed in the news media, right? So I think seeing them as children and not animals, that's what the film did.
Yeah,
the film said, see this young fella and see him playing with his daughter and how much fun his daughter is having with her dad that she loves a whole lot.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much, both of you. Donald Osgood Sr., Ruth Zakarin, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
It was our pleasure. Yes.